Conservatives have never forgiven Anthony Fauci for saving millions of lives during the AIDS crisis, and that grudge is helping to drive the farce currently playing out on Capitol Hill. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian of queer history. Dr. Anthony Fauci's work in the discovery, diagnosis, and treatment of HIV and AIDS cannot be overstated. He was one of the leading researchers from the very earliest days of the epidemic. He started his work looking for a vaccine or a treatment in 1981. Fauci's research team are the ones who discovered the paradox of AIDS, that it both destroys the immune system and increases immunological activity. They are also the ones who discovered that HIV constantly replicates, even very early after infection, and that it occurs in lymph nodes. Their research paper on that discovery was the most cited by AIDS researchers worldwide for years. The list of things that Fauci's team discovered or tested is a mile long, and the speed at which they worked, although it looked painfully slow from the outside, was the research equivalent of supersonic. When he became the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in 1984, a position that he held until 2022, Fauci became responsible not just for the research, but also for the politics of getting money out of Congress to fund it and for advising the White House. The first White House he had to advise was Reagan's. During the first Bush administration, in the days of compassionate conservatism, Fauci was also one of the key architects of PEPFAR, a program that saved tens of millions of lives in the developing world until the Trump administration gutted USAID last year. Now, PEPFAR is hanging on by a thread, but I digress. Dr. Anthony Fauci is now recognized by queer activists as the only true and great hero among U.S. government officials during the AIDS crisis. But that was a hard-won recognition, because being the face of the U.S. government's response to the crisis meant that Fauci was hated by conservatives and queer activists alike. Conservatives hated Fauci because he was trying to save lives that they thought should end. Reagan's government and the conservatives who supported it wanted queer people and later IV drug users and black people to die. They have never forgiven Fauci for interrupting what they saw as God's righteous punishment for wicked people. Reagan's advisors on the AIDS crisis during his first term, all of whom were conservative activists, except for Fauci, and none of whom were members of the LGBTQ+ community, encouraged Reagan to frame AIDS as a moral failing of its victims. In June of 1983, Pat Buchanan, who went on to become the White House communications director, wrote in the Washington Post, "The poor homosexuals, they have declared war on nature, and now nature is exacting an awful retribution." As you might imagine, this meant that epidemiologists and public health officials were fighting their own government while trying to gain control of an epidemic that was sickening and killing exponentially more people as it spread. Sound familiar? It also meant that Fauci, as the visible federal public health official, was hated by queer activists. And nobody hated Anthony Fauci more than playwright and activist Larry Kramer, who called him a monster, an incompetent idiot, a pill-pushing tool of the medical establishment, and who compared Fauci to the Nazi officer who oversaw the logistics of transferring millions of Jews to extermination camps, Adolf Eichmann. In 1988, Larry Kramer wrote this blistering opening letter to Fauci and flat out called him a murderer. But Larry Kramer is also the reason that Fauci's work is now recognized as heroic, because Anthony Fauci and Larry Kramer finally met in May of 1989 at an AIDS conference in Montreal. Fauci was out walking with an assistant when he came across Kramer walking his dog, Molly, outside the hotel. Fauci described the meeting like two generals in a war coming together for a little bit of a truce and saying, you know, we're both soldiers and maybe we're on the same side and we're not on opposite sides. So they walked Molly together, and they talked. Much to Fauci's surprise, Kramer was willing to talk to him, and much to Kramer's surprise, Fauci was willing to listen. And he did listen. Fauci credits Kramer with, among other things, changing the way that clinical trials are run. At Kramer's suggestion, Fauci's team started bringing in AIDS patients and frontline medical personnel early on in the process as consultants, rather than designing their drug trials in a lab vacuum. The two struck up a very close friendship that lasted until Kramer's death in 2020, though they still fought fiercely about the best way to approach the AIDS crisis, often live on television in front of millions of viewers, because Kramer knew that the angry exchanges would keep AIDS in the headlines. That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.
You know, I want to say something about Tony Fauci, because I think the world must think I hate him or something, the way I'm going on tonight. I love Tony. Actually, I think I probably have a more complicated relationship with Tony than anybody in my entire life. He is a man, an ordinary man, who is being asked to play God, and he is being punished because he cannot be God.